Here we go. We have former Harlem drug kingpin and author of the book, The Crack Era, The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of Kevin Chiles in the building.
Thank you for having me, Vlad.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, we've known of each other for a long time now.
That's
going
true.
back almost 20 years.
That's a fact.
But this is actually the first time we're sitting down together.
Yeah, we've crossed paths a couple of times, but you're right, this is actually the first time, yep.
So let's go ahead and start in the very beginning. Well, you grew up in the Bronx.
Yes.
You were born in Highbridge. You were a kid in Highbridge.
I was a kid in Highbridge, absolutely, yep.
And then you moved to Soundview.
Right.
When you were 14.
Right. That's the Bronx as well, North Bronx.
Exactly. And you actually grew up in a two-parent home.
I did.
Your mom had two kids.
Myself and my little brother, my younger brother, actually, yeah.
What was the age difference?
2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pretty close.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, even though you had both parents, you guys were still struggling.
Yes.
Okay. So talk about the struggle as a kid.
Well, my mother worked consistently. My father worked construction, and back then construction might, last a month or so, maybe 2 months, 3 months, maybe 6 months at the most. Then he may not work for another 6 months. So it was just a job that really wasn't too stable.
Okay. And I mean, you were actually so poor that you were putting cardboard in your sneakers sometimes.
Yeah, I don't think it was just me. It was pretty common. This was the neighborhood that I lived in. Most people had the same economical status, so I think it was pretty common across the board. It wasn't just me and my brother. It was, kids of the neighborhood.
Right. You had holes in your socks and,
right.
Only a couple pairs of jeans. And
right.
Okay. So here you are, you're growing up in the Bronx, 2 kids, dad is out of work a lot, which I'm sure is causing arguments in the house.
Absolutely.
And, as you're rolling around the Bronx, you're seeing all this money get made illegally on the street.
Yeah, at some point, yeah, that was what was happening.
Okay. At what point did you start to realize what was happening?
Probably the age 11, 12, 13, you just seen some of the neighborhood kids who was like maybe 7, 8 years older than me. You seen that, they were doing certain things. I wasn't quite sure what it was initially, but at some point you just sort of understand it because you're from the neighborhood, you pick it up.
Right, and this is the 70s at the time.
Yeah, it is, right, early 70s, yep.
Okay, and back then, heroin pretty much ran the drug trade.
I would come to understand that, yeah, at some point. I didn't know what it was, but as I probably became a teenager, I knew what it was then, yeah, so it was heroin, definitely.
I mean, were you seeing the heroin addicts on the streets and so forth?
Not so much in the Bronx. It was more in Harlem that I noticed it, like junkies leaning and I guess what they would call dope fiends. Yeah, I noticed that more in Harlem, not so much in the Bronx.
Okay. And you had an uncle that actually was already a drug dealer?
Yeah, he was.
Okay. So talk about how you and your uncle started to develop your relationship.
Well, my uncle is not my blood uncle. It's my mother's sister's husband. And they was always pretty much well off, and there was a distinct difference between my family and theirs. So whenever I visited their house, they had cars and they lived in the suburbs. So it was a stark contrast from the Bronx to the suburbs, like literally night and day.
And you kind of became a chauffeur in a way.
Yeah, in my teenage years, yeah.
All right, so you would drive him around while he was doing his various illegal activities, basically?
No, it didn't happen like that. During the 70s, well, during that time, most the guys who sold heroin, they actually used it as well as selling it. I mean, it was a social drug, so it was either cocaine or heroin. And one time I was driving with him, and he was sort of like nodding off, and it's sort of like it was a organic kind of thing, just due to our safety, and I had, just begun to learn how to drive, so I actually ended up start driving for him just for the sake of not us getting killed.
Right, and back then, I mean, both heroin and cocaine were just considered social drugs. Right. You would walk into a bar and people would sniff some cocaine right there out in the open.
Right.
I mean, these days that's unheard of.
Absolutely.
But back then it was just
commonplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think you had mentioned movies like Superfly.
Right.
All the fly dudes have like a little, vial of cocaine in their necklace.
Bills. They had in dollar bills or money. It was folded up in money. Yeah.
So you're kind of starting to see some of what's happening around your uncle. And back then, the Italians pretty much controlled the heroin business.
They absolutely did.
Yep. If you wanted heroin, you had to deal with
you had to have a connect
with the mafia.
That's a fact.
Okay. Did you ever deal with them later on?
No. By the time that I was in position, It was mostly Dominicans and Colombians at that point, and the drug of choice had changed. It wasn't so much heroin as much as it was coke and crack.
Okay. So at what point did you actually start selling drugs yourself?
Probably, well, I started selling marijuana in high school. You know, we would buy like $20 bags, $10 bags, and you would sell loose joints. You would maybe double your money. So if you spent $50, you made $100. And that was sort of like a hustle that I did in high school, you know, to get by. I mean, prior to that, I did odd and end hustles, but the actual progression to selling narcotics was marijuana in probably about the 10th, 11th grade.
Okay. When did it graduate to cocaine?
Probably my high school year, going into my first year of college.
Okay. And what was the first couple of deals like?
Selling like 50s and 25s and grams, well, half grams, you know, 8 balls, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess you were dealing with the Dominicans in terms of getting it?
Yeah, initially. Well, no, initially I was getting it from my uncle once I convinced him that, you know, I was going to do it with or without his help. I guess he figured it'd be better off if he sort of like oversaw what I was doing for the sake of, again, safety.
Okay, so your uncle was actually supplying cocaine for you?
Yes. Yeah, early on.
Early on?
Early on.
But then you graduated to?
Dominicans and Colombians.
Okay. And back then it was sort of I mean, you described it as a lawless time.
It absolutely
where
was.
like the Nicky Barnes era before you literally had lines around the corner to the, you know, to the drug houses.
Right, it were.
Like broad daylight,
absolutely.
Cops driving around.
Right, like it seemed almost acceptable.
Like an open air market.
That's exactly what it was.
Why didn't the cops, I mean, the cops aren't stupid. I mean, they see what's happening.
I agree with you. You know, I don't know, I mean, you know, you look at a lot of movies from back then and a lot of law enforcement was on the take. I mean, even with that being the case, like it just was so obvious that there had to be an explanation for one that I couldn't provide.
Right, because who wants to live around that? Who wants to live next to a dope fiend house, you know, with junkies all around?
Right, you know, but if you were there in the landscape, it was so commonplace that it just appeared to be normal to the residents in the community because it's just what it was.
Okay, now your uncle had a lieutenant named Nappy Red.
No, Nappy Red his lieutenant was a guy named Norman. Norman was Nappy Red's uncle, and Nappy Red was his nephew.
Ah, okay. Sorry, I got it slightly wrong. And the two of you actually became friends.
We did, through the introduction through both our uncles, who we all consider ourselves family.
Got it. And then you guys actually went into business together.
Eventually, yeah, because he was running a spot himself, working in one.
Now, was this a coke spot or a crack spot?
It was a crack spot at this point. This is about 85, late 85, early 86.
Okay, so crack hit Harlem.
Absolutely.
Before then, it was just cocaine and heroin.
Right.
And there was freebase, but that was a rich man's drug.
Right.
You needed ether, and you needed to know what you were actually doing, or else you'd blow up your whole house trying to make it.
Potentially, yes.
Or blow yourself up like Richard Pryor did.
That's a fact.
So people really didn't freebase that much.
No. I never witnessed anyone do it.
Right. But then crack came along.
Right.
And it was fairly easy to make.
Yeah.
You could churn a small amount of cocaine into a bunch of crack rocks.
Right.
And increase your profit a lot. And the addiction was a lot higher.
I guess it all depends on who you ask. Heroin addiction was pretty...
Well, compared to cocaine.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Compared to cocaine. Yeah, heroin addiction is horrible.
Right.
So when crack first hit Harlem and really the whole country, how did you really see it go down, and how did you see it affect your neighborhoods?
I think, well, early on, we didn't notice it because the transition between most guys who sold heroin were older guys. You know, when crack came about, the older hustlers who sold heroin weren't overly interested in selling crack. It was a novelty to them because of the amount of money that they made selling heroin. Heroin is an extreme difference in selling heroin and selling crack. So it was a bunch of young kids was doing it, and I don't even know if we were our perspective of it was where we was evaluating to see what You know, it would be years later where we would realize the devastation that occurred from it.
Right, because I remember I interviewed Freeway Ricky a bunch of times, and he was saying how people really don't become crackheads overnight. It's
No,
a
it was
relatively slow process. And I mean, he was saying how he was selling to his own relatives at the time.
Well, some of the guys who I was down with, some of their family members were using it.
Yeah.
And at the time, again, we didn't see the wrong in it.
Right.
You know.
Did you ever sell it to your own relatives?
No, I didn't have anybody that in my family who actually used crack. You know, I don't ever remember anybody that, you know, that I knew personally from my family. No.